About that. I hate to keep you waiting. Boys, are we on? Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Adult Sunday School here at Friendship Bible. Let's go to the Lord in prayer and ask His blessing for this morning's study, and we'll get started. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you for everyone who came out today. We thank you for your word. We're humbled and we're thankful that in this time, in this era, we can still come together. We can study your word. We can investigate the truths that you're trying to teach us and still grow and have some measure of peace here on a Sunday morning. So just thank you for your word. Thank you for the blessings of a church family. Thank you for the gatherings in the morning. And I just pray for this morning's lesson that you'll open up hearts and minds to your word, to your truths. And as Pastor Paul brings the sermon on Sunday morning this morning, that it'll be a blessing for all of us. And I just pray all these things, Lord, in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, I'm going to do a very brief review. So usually do a little bit more advanced review, but last week we were looking at an introduction to chapter 11. So I wanted to give a nice introduction for some context before we even studied chapter 11. And so that was last week, so we weren't in the Word much. So this is a very, very short review to set up our chapter. Now first, I wanted to remind you that although I can't be sure that civil war was imminent in Israel after Saul was publicly recognized as king in chapter 10, the process of choosing a king and the selection of Saul himself certainly seemed to create factions. There was factions in Israel. Some of these detractors, called Ben Belial, are sons of worthlessness, men of low moral character, may have been the ones who didn't want a king in the first place. That was their major issue. Others from this group, called Ben Belial, may have been jealous because the first king didn't come from their own tribe. They are severely regarded by the Lord in chapter 10. They're regarded in this way because their rebellion was ultimately against God and His newly anointed king. Their rebellion, their problem was going to cause a divide. And so the Lord had to handle it. Whatever the case may be, whether it's jealousy or they didn't want a king, Israel was headed for trouble, and the Lord knew it. So He inserted Himself into human history, using Nahash's own evil inclinations for oppressing Israel. And He created a way to keep the nation together, utilizing His infinite wisdom. And that's what we take out of this introduction as we looked at this last week. God stepped into human history. God uses infinite wisdom. The divine plan was the Lord is going to take care of these factions, keep the nation together. It will not be a civil war, but rather a uniting of Israel that we're going to see this morning. I wanted to remind you that a manuscript containing 1 Samuel was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It had additions to the traditional text, and we will take these as historical rather than scriptural. All right, they're like historical documents. This is what the section called 4Q Sam says. Now Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, had been oppressing the Gadites and the Reubenites grievously, gouging out the right eye of each of them and allowing Israel no deliverer. No men of the Israelites who were across the Jordan, that's on the east side, remain whose right eye Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, had not gouged out. But 7,000 men had escaped from the Ammonites and entered into Jabesh-Gilead. So historians and some historians add that verse in and say that this is good. This is a good text. And so that gives us a little bit more information about what was exactly going on here. It's called 4Q Sam. Now, looking at the map last week, we see that Jabesh was pretty far from Nahash's capital city of Rabat Ammon, pretty far west and a little bit to the north of Ammon. 4Q Sam tells us basically why Nahash was besieging Jabesh. Why this city? Now, we're going to read 1 Samuel 11 together, and I want to actually start in 1 Samuel 10:25. So if you want to open up your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 10, I want to give us a whole overview and context of the section, and then we'll go and read all of chapter 11. So I do want to start in 10:25. So I'll be reading 1 Samuel 10:25 all the way through the rest of the chapter. It'll be up here if you want to follow along the board. Okay, here we go. Then Samuel told the people the ordinances of the kingdom and wrote them in a book, verse 25, and placed it before the Lord, and Samuel sent all the people away, each one to his house. Saul also went to his house at Gibeah, and the valiant men whose hearts God had touched went with him. But certain worthless men, Ben-Belial, said, "How can this one deliver us?" And they despised him and did not bring him any presents. But he kept silent, or, as some manuscripts say, 1 month later. Very interesting. 1 month later. Now Nahash the Ammonite, verse 1, chapter 11, came up and besieged Jabesh-Gilead. Why was he besieging? Because 7,000 men had escaped him, and they ran to Jabesh, and they were hiding out. And all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, "Make a covenant with us, and we will serve you." Now Nahash the Ammonite said to them, "I will make a covenant with you on this condition, that I gouge out the right eye of every one of you. Thus I will make a reproach on all Israel." The elders of Jabesh said to him, "Let us alone for 7 days, that we may send messengers throughout the territory of Israel on the west side of the Jordan," right? Messengers. "Then if there is no one to deliver us, we will come out to you." That's verse 3 of chapter 11. Verse 4. Then the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and spoke those words in the hearing of the people. And all the people lifted up their voices and wept. Now behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen, and he said, "What is the matter with the people that they weep?" So they related to him the words of the men of Jabesh. Then the Spirit of God came upon Saul mightily when he heard these words, and he became very angry, and he took a yoke of oxen and cut them in pieces and sent them throughout the territory of Israel by the hand of messengers, saying, "Whoever does not come out after Saul and after Samuel, so it shall be done to his oxen." Then the dread of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out as one man. He numbered them in Bezek, and the sons of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah were 30,000. And they said to the messengers who had come, "Thus you shall say to the men of Jabesh-Gilead, tomorrow, by the time the sun is hot, you shall have deliverance." So the messengers went and told the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. Verse 10. Then the men of Jabesh said, "Tomorrow," to Nahash, "tomorrow we will come out to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good to you." And it happened the next morning that Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp at the morning watch and struck down the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And it came about that those who survived from the Ammonites were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. Then the people said to Samuel, notice this, "Who is he that said, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Bring the men that we may put them to death." But Saul said, "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished deliverance in Israel." Then Samuel said to the people, "Come and let us go to Gilgal again, right, and renew the kingdom there." So the people all went to Gilgal, and they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. They also offered sacrifices of peace offerings before the Lord. And there Saul and the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. Notes, top of page 1. Let's just take a look at the first 3 verses, and I'll put it in context. I put in there about 1 month later. Again, the manuscript, the alternative translation there is thought to be about a month later. So basically, we're talking about a pretty quick turnaround when Samuel dismissed all the people and Saul went back to the fields. And so this is about a month later, and Nahash is besieging Jabesh. So Jabesh-Gilead, again, I went over some of this, so let's review, was a fortified city. It was a fortified city. It was on the east side of the Jordan River, where the 2.5 tribes were, in the tribal territory of Gad. The city lay significantly northwest of Nahash's capital city of Rabat Ammon. So if you know where Rabat Ammon is, and you can see the map there, that blue line is the trail, or how far Nahash's army would travel all the way up to Jabesh. So that was a little bit of a trek there. According to 4Q Sam, he furiously pursued 7,000 Gadites and Reubenites to the city of Jabesh, where these men fled and they sought refuge. Nahash had the city surrounded and had set up a siege. Now, even with the added forces of Gad and Reuben, the leadership of Jabesh were outnumbered and outmanned. And they decided they had little chance against the army of Nahash, so that they did what was normal in this type of situation with unwinnable odds. They decided to surrender with terms. So what happens here in the very first verses? They're going to surrender. When they sent a message out to Nahash to say, make a covenant with us, they're surrendering with terms. We'll surrender, and here are the terms of the surrender. So they asked Nahash to make a covenant with them. Now, the Hebrew word for covenant here is berit, and it is interchangeable with the word treaty. So if berit occurs in a context of an army or in battle, we're talking more of a treaty. If it occurs between one person and another, berit means, kind of like a personal covenant between two people. Of course, Jacob and Laban made a covenant. They made a berit, a treaty with each other when they parted ways, right? You stay on your side, and I'll stay on my side. That was the treaty there. So that's berit. So we could think of it as a treaty. The type of surrender occurred often and was beneficial for both sides. Whether you're the besieging army or the one being besieged. This is an important step here. The attacking army didn't waste valuable resources that would be lost during a long siege. In agreeable terms, saved some lives and some time, and avoided heavily property damage that the besieging army might use for spoils. So they didn't want the city ruined, especially if they're going to take their spoils. The besieged would avoid heavy loss of life, and sometimes it was avoid being destroyed completely, right? I mean, heavy loss of life, and sometimes they would save their homes. In terms of the treaty, would save their livelihoods. They could go about their everyday lives and keep their fields if they surrendered under terms. And that's what's going on here. Now, under normal circumstances, the leaders of Jabesh and Nahash would have done what was called cut a covenant. That would have reduced casualties, time, resources for both sides. Everybody with me? So they're going to cut a covenant. Now, we have talked about this phrase before. Pastor George's study, our study through Judges. The word cut is not synonymous for make, as is the case in modern times. And if I said to you, hey, I cut a deal, you would understand it to be that the word would be make or cut. I could use them interchangeably. Make and cut are synonymous. But in ancient times, that is not true. These words are not synonymous. The phrase is very literal. When two people or groups of people wanted to ratify a covenant together, And they took these covenants and promises very seriously. We talked about vows, covenants. Any ancient peoples of the Middle East would have taken these terms very, very seriously. And they tend to break these covenants lightly. But they would cut an animal in half, spread its entrails between the animal parts. And usually 2 people or 2 representative people would walk between the animals, the cut up animals, and they would walk the trail here in between. But the covenant was literally sealed in the animal's blood. And it came with an oath or a promise taken, recited by the 2 parties or the 2 representative parties. But Nahash was not being a very agreeable fellow, if you see in this chapter, right? So I wanted you to understand what was going on here. His terms were a bit extreme. So I want you to understand what is happening in these verses. Nahash is acting in an anti-Semitic rage. And it shows in his suggested treaty. This is what Nahash was basically saying in these verses. Nahash dictates that the deal that we cut will not involve an animal. Rather, it will be sealed in the blood from the right eye of every single male in your city. So understand that. That's the covenant he wants to make. It'll be sealed in the blood that spills out of the right eye of all these Israelites. That's the covenant he wants.
Did it actually happen?
I don't know. Let's find out. Well, let's find out. We're going to find out. The author's going to tell us what happens here. But I wanted you to understand. Right there at this point, they understand the demand of Nahash. And they understand. He was only going to make a treaty. His terms of surrender were, I need your right eye. And that would seal the covenant. All right, and I wanted you to understand that. Now, this demand from Nahash takes on new meaning. The right side of anything was regarded as the best side, except if you were Benjamites, actually, because there was a lot of left-handers in Benjamin. But besides that, the right hand is the powerful side. It's purposeful. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for my feet. If you put somebody on your right side or your right hand, that is a place of honor and favor. All right, so there's that, as opposed to the left side, the right side, that was purposeful. He didn't want their left eyes. He wanted their right eyes. The act of having the right eye removed would bring about great shame. And we talked about ancient Israel. Shame and honor. Shame and honor. And so any individual was either under shame or in a state of honor. And so it would be an embarrassment for all these men to have the right eye gouged out. It would be shameful. Nahash knew this. That was the purpose too. So the author tells us that, if you notice in this passage, that Nahash's driving motive was just that, to humiliate Israel, to humiliate these men. It also would leave these men incapacitated. So it would have dual purpose. A secondary purpose is that they would be incapacitated, at least on the battlefield, right? You have a bunch of men with no right eye, they cannot defend Israel. You would have a blind spot in a sword fight. You couldn't operate a bow and arrow properly and aim with one eye. This would thwart any type of rebellion. Now, make no mistake, it was more important to him to humiliate Israel because he had the upper hand, but it also served that secondary purpose. Well, the elders of Jabesh sent a request to Nahash that they would be allowed 7 days to ask their brethren for help. And if none comes, then they would accept his horrible terms of surrender. Now, I don't know if you asked the same question when you read this as well, or when we just read it together. Why would Nahash do this? Why would Nahash give them an out and allow them 7 days to seek help? I mean, it seems to me that he thought that there was little chance that Jabesh would receive help from the tribes across the Jordan. And this kind of event here gives us a clue into the stark division that existed between the tribes on the east side of Jordan with those on the west. I mean, even Nahash, an enemy king, knew that there was no dealings between the two sides. And so I think he understood that. This is another suggestion that I read from a scholar. They said that maybe he also wanted the word to spread of his ruthlessness and as a warning to the other tribes to the west. In other words, if you intervene, this will also happen to you as well. Either way, he allows it. And so he allows them to send messengers out of the city to go seek help. But I think that Nahash did not think for a moment that they could muster up any help and that the tribes on the west would simply ignore what was going on as long as Nahash didn't cross the Jordan. They were fine. I don't think he thought in any way that there would be help. Verses 4 through 7, then the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and spoke these words. We're in the top of page 2, verses 4 through 7, hearing these words in the hearing of the people. And all the people lifted up their voices and wept. Now behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen, and he said, what is the matter with the people that they weep? So they related to him the words of the men of Jabesh. Then the Spirit of God came upon Saul mightily when he heard these words, and he became very angry. And he took a yoke of oxen and cut them in pieces and sent them throughout the territory of Israel by the hand of the messengers, saying, whoever does not come out after Saul and after Samuel, so it shall be done to his oxen. Then the dread of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out as one man. So we have this section. Messengers arrive in Jabesh. Now, I spent time introducing chapter 11 so that the actions and reactions of the people would make sense to us. Logically, the messengers went to Gibeah. Why? Why, of all the cities on the west side of the Jordan, did they go to Gibeah? It was home of their blood relatives. It was, if there was anyone on the west side of the Jordan who would come to their aid, it would be their blood relatives in Gibeah. Upon hearing, so they go to the one place that they would get help. Upon hearing about the siege and the terms set by Nahash, the people of Gibeah wept and wailed over this devastating news, fearing the well-being of their extended family. Another factor of it for this outcry was the residents of Gibeah technically owed a century-old debt to the residents of Jabesh-Gilead for siding with them in the civil war of Judges 19 through 21. And you remember that. So when all 11 tribes gathered against Benjamin over the myrrh of the Levite's concubine, then there was one actual city, one city that did not join the 11 tribes. They sided, even though their part was, we're not going to get involved, but they technically sided with Benjamin. And then we know that the 400 virgins from that city was taken to marry Benjamites, and now we have a bunch of Benjamites and Gadites that have mixed bloodlines. Peculiar also was the fact that in God's sovereign plan, the first king of Israel happened to live in Gibeah and would get word of the plight of Jabesh-Gilead. Funny how those things work out. What a bunch of serendipity. Couldn't have worked out better if I planned it myself. Saul happened to be in Gibeah. Saul may have personally had Gadite ancestry in his bloodlines. So the word comes to Saul, and we see their reaction, and we understand their reaction of Gibeah. Some of their relatives, some of their people, some of their own blood relatives, family members are in trouble. Maybe even some amongst Saul's family ancestry. Now, verse 5, we're at the bottom of page 2. Right on the back page. Right here. Verse 5. So verse 5, when we look, we're on 4 through 7, goes on to explain that Saul was out plowing his fields with oxen. Doesn't sound like a king, does it? What happened to the king? Why in the world is a king out plowing with oxen? Now, it more than likely was his own fields, but it could have personally even been his father's field. He's still working for his father. Either way, this is not kingly. When the message from Jabesh-Gilead, the messengers, arrived in Gibeah, the wailing was so loud that Saul heard the cry as he made his way back into the city. So he was done for the day, comes back into the city, and he hears all the wailing and the weeping. And when he heard the reason for the people's wailing and crying, he became highly agitated and angry. Some explain that this anger to be a righteous anger that resulted from the Spirit of God coming upon him. Now, I am not sold on this notion because Saul was often found acting rashly when times were difficult and stressful. I would rather separate the two things. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Saul, but then Saul acted as Saul does. Two separate things happening at the same time. We can separate those as far as I'm concerned. Same thing with us. We all have the Spirit of God, but doesn't God's people sometimes act rashly? Just having the Spirit of God doesn't mean I can't act rashly ever now, because I got the Spirit. So just understanding what I'm driving at here. And I want to try to flesh that out. And if anybody does have any disagreement or they would like to talk, we can talk about this afterwards. But the statement that Spirit of God came upon Saul mightily was the same one used for men like Samson. Same language, same verbiage there. When God was empowering them to deliver Israel, that's what happened to all of the judges, the Shofet. Of course, Saul now had the resolve, along with the new divine capability to lead men into battle. Why was this necessary? Well, you can tell from the passages, right? From the lead up to this point, there is no evidence that Saul had ever had any leadership skills whatsoever, right? Let alone any military experience to accomplish such a monumental victory, and yet this is what the Spirit gave to him. The ability to lead men into battle, and he will be empowered. So that is a fact. Saul is being empowered by the Holy Spirit to do the central thing a king was supposed to do for his people. The king was supposed to lead men into battle to defeat an oppressive army. So Saul is going to absolutely be given power to do his job, his duty as king. But just like Samson's behavior, it was often rash amidst the episode of the Spirit's empowerment, here Saul's anger had much to do with his own family having aunts and uncles and cousins and in-laws and friends who were under attack and in grave danger at Jabesh-Gilead. Now, it is not wrong for him to be righteously angry in this passage and to have some sort of anger that Nahash dare attack his blood relatives. I mean, that's fine. But then Saul's response, as led by the Spirit, is a strange one. So the Spirit leading him causes him, he cuts up his oxen and sends the pieces off to the other tribes along with a message that they are to gather for battle against Nahash. So if you don't divide these two things, and the Spirit led him to cut up his oxen and send those oxen out. Now there was a threat in this request. Anyone who refuses will have their own oxen cut to pieces in the same manner. Possibly it doesn't stop there, with a subtle hint that they may personally suffer the same fate as their oxen, or at least he's saying that they were going to be disciplined severely if they didn't comply. And we see this in Israel's history. It has happened before. So make no mistake, he's not innocently sending 12 pieces of oxen out there and saying, I'm going to cut up your oxen. I think the veiled threat is you're going to suffer some consequence if you do not step forward in battle here, if you do not comply. Now, this is what we call a veiled threat. And I see that here. This is my point. Saul is certainly being empowered by the Spirit and given a firm resolve and even skills or a spiritual gift not previously possessed to lead men into battle against Nahash. But this anger of Saul's and the ensuing behavior reminds me of, in a few chapters, a rash vow he makes later in the heat of battle, and with a stir of emotion in chapter 14. Saul makes a foolish decision, all while being equipped by the Spirit to lead Israel into that exact battle. Saul seems to make bad decisions at the height of his emotions, and this will ultimately cost him the kingdom. Now, some might disagree, but the cutting up of his oxen to me and sending the pieces throughout Israel seems to be of Saul, not of the Holy Spirit. Now, I'm clarifying this incident to show a personality characteristic that continues throughout his reign. This is not the last time he will act in this manner. Some may see it as righteous indignation, and Saul was trying, if he hadn't have sent the pieces of oxen out to his countrymen, they never would have rallied behind him, and maybe that is the case. But I just have to separate the two, and I don't see this as rash behavior. Matter of fact, this is what really disgusts me. Where might Saul have got the idea of cutting the ox and sending it to the 12 tribes of Israel? Where do you think he came up with that? You think he came up with that on his own? That's right. If you guess Judges 19, the story of the Levite and his concubine, you may be right. When the Levite left Gibeah with his dead concubine loaded up on a donkey, this is what Judges 19 says. This is what it tells us. Verse 28, then he placed her on a donkey, and the man arose and went to his home. And when he entered his house, he took a knife and laid hold of his concubine and cut her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout the territory of Israel. All who saw it said, nothing like this has ever happened or been seen from the day when the sons of Israel came up from the land of Egypt to this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak up.
That people just sit there and let them tear them up?
He went to his own home, took his concubine, cut her up into 12 pieces, sent messengers from his home throughout Israel to say, this is what happened to my concubine in Gibeah. And then the 11 tribes rallied against Gibeah, and it was going to be a siege against Gibeah and a punishment to those men. But then all the Benjamite nation supported Gibeah, and now we have a war between the 11 tribes and Gibeah and Benjamin, right? And that's what happens in the book of Judges. He cut his concubine up to make a point.
But she just sat there and let them cut her?
She was dead.
Oh, okay.
She was raped and murdered in the town of Gibeah, Saul's town. So here's my point on all this. As a little boy, this would have been a Bible story that Saul was taught in Sunday school. It would have been right up there with the modern you lie, you die Sunday school lesson about Ananias and Sapphira taught today in our Sunday school, taught by our Sunday school teachers as a cautionary tale for little boys and girls, being a little sarcastic. I am being sarcastic, but the point is, there would probably be no child who grew up in either Jabesh or Gibeah who didn't hear or know this story and heard it many times, even as kids. Saul seemed to model his reaction after the Levite from Judges 19. So the Spirit came upon him, but he acted independently from the Spirit in cutting up the oxen and threatening the other tribes. The result was all the Lord's. Whether he was wrong or not, it got the job done. The pieces of the oxen were sent, they responded, and now we have a unified Israel coming together against Nahash. And so we can see both independent behaviors of Saul, but also the Spirit's leading and God's guidance here. Because the very last part or portion of verse 7 says, then the dread of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out as one man. So either way, we have the Lord's will be done. And we have a unified Israel now coming to the aid of against Nahash, coming to the aid of Jabesh. Now, I do want to stop for quick questions if anybody has any questions thus far. Any comments they want to make about the Spirit, anything they thought about when they were reading about the Spirit come upon Saul, his reaction, cutting up the oxen, anything. Mary.
Just to clarify it for my own thinking, are you saying that it's as if the Spirit of the Lord motivated him to step up and take on a kingly role in order to protect the nation as a king would do.
Right.
However, without the wisdom of God, he didn't handle it correctly.
Right.
Is that what you're basically saying?
Yeah, like I would say, if I was going to take a guess, that Saul was being equipped to lead Israel, but he decided, because he didn't think they would follow him, he didn't trust the Lord. You know, if I wanted, like I said, I want to project out, he didn't trust the Lord. So instead of doing that, he sent these pieces of his oxen. He acted in an extreme manner to threaten them so that they would follow him. The Lord's will was done, because that's what the Lord's will was. But I don't see this as any act of the Spirit by cutting up his oxen and sending it in Israel. And I could be wrong, but
Okay.
that's my point.
Well, then, if we wanted to apply it to, say, our life today, we can see injustice happening around us, even politically, and the Spirit of God may certainly motivate us to be upset over injustice, but then how do we handle that? What do we say and how we say it
Right.
makes a
good
big
point.
difference.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, we as believers led by the Spirit, when we see the stuff surrounding us, we get some righteous anger, right? We feel righteously anger about the things that are surrounding us, and then there's a response. Good. And is that what you're saying? Right. Very good. Any other comments? Sure. Just so they can, I'll repeat it first. Yes.
What was the reason the 6,000 went north and left Ammon in the first place? Did you say that already?
Yeah, we talked about that. Her question was, why did the 7,000 go? I mean, it doesn't tell us what the thought of the men were, but we talked about how Jabesh-Gilead was a fortified city. And you can see that it was very close to the Jordan River. So the Reubenites were here, and the Gadites were here, and Ammon is right here. Okay, you see how far Jabesh is from Ammon, from Rabat? Do you see Rabat right there where it says Ammon? You see the capital? See, look at how far he had to take his army all the way up to Jabesh. So I would think that the reason why is it was very close to a fording point right there across. You see how close? I think Jabesh is only a couple miles from the Jordan River, so they would be able to ford over there. So it was a fortified city, very close and very far north from Nahash's capital. So they ran as far as they could go within their own tribal territory.
Because they were going to be killed if they stayed.
Oh, yeah, if they stayed in their own, right. So remember that it said that there was not one single person who didn't have their right eye gouged out by Nahash. The 7,000 still had their right eyes, and they wanted to keep them. So the 7,000 thought, let me get as far away from this guy as possible, and they fled the battlefield, and wherever Nahash's armies were, which you can imagine is in Reuben and Gad, maybe south, a little bit closer to Ammon's capital, and they just fled north. And the first fortified city that they came upon that they figured they might get some help is Jabesh. But we do have to do a little bit of speculation because it really doesn't tell us exactly what the thinking was of the leaders of those men. But I do know this, the 7,000 wanted to keep their right eyes, and apparently Nahash was angry enough and mad enough that he pursued those Israelites all the way up to Jabesh. So he went way into Gad's territory this time with his army, surrounded Jabesh-Gilead, and then, of course, made his unreasonable terms. I want your right eyes. Now, I want the right eyes of everybody in Jabesh as well, and the 7,000 right eyes owed to me already. You see the anti-Semitic rage and bent from this man?
You mean they just stood there and let the guy cut them right out?
No, he didn't. Well, the tribes of Reuben and Gad were being defeated militarily. And when he caught and defeated them, he made them stand there and have their right eye gouged out. That was what he did to shame all the tribes of Reuben and Gad. This is what this man was doing. Well, when you're captured and you don't sit there and let anybody do anything, you're at their mercy. Yeah, nobody's letting them do anything. He is taking the right eye because he's stronger than them. He defeats them in battle, and then all the prisoners, he gouges the right eye. And any city he takes over, in Reuben and Gad, he takes the right eye out of all those people, fighting men. Oh, I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you. It doesn't say. Yeah. So this man now has the Jabesh surrounded. All right, so everybody good? Bottom of page 3. What happens? How they rally, right? God gives Saul victory over the Ammonites, and we have like a very positive part of this chapter right here. It says he numbered them in Bezek, and the sons of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah were 30,000. And they said to the messengers who had come, thus you shall say to the men of Jabesh-Gilead, tomorrow, by the time the sun is hot, you will have deliverance. So the messengers went and told the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. And the men of Jabesh said, tomorrow we will come out to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good to you. The next morning Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp at the morning watch, and struck down, top of page 4, the Ammonites until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered. Those of Nahash's army were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. Now we just finished verse 11. That's 8 through 11 there. Now Saul rallied the men of Israel, and they gathered at a little-known city named Bezek. Now I'm sure Bezek was known at the time of Saul, but historically, archaeology, we're not really sure about Bezek. So in that sense, there's little known about Bezek itself. But the thought is they think they found where Bezek probably was. It was on the west side of the Jordan, almost basically directly across from Jabesh, which was on the east side. Now, here is a map. I'm going to put the map up for me, guys, to give you a general idea where each army is located, okay? And so we have at the very, very bottom of the map to the left here, and you can look on your notes, and you can see that the Israelite army gathered under Saul at Bezek, and you can see that is the west side of the Jordan, and almost directly across the Jordan on the east side is Jabesh-Gilead. And so that was a great staging ground for the army to make sure all the Israelites gathered and many people could gather at once. And it was pretty close to what would be the battlefield. So there's Bezek and there is Jabesh over there. And they would cross at a nice fording point in the Jordan River, and they would be over at Jabesh pretty quickly. So that's the idea there as the track, the blue track for the king, Nahash, and then, of course, Saul's army all the way up in Bezek. All right, everybody got the idea there? Now, I want you to notice something about the author's description of this gathering. I want to talk about this. Why not say that 330,000 men of Israel gathered that day at Bezek? 330,000 men of Israel gathered at Bezek. Isn't that true? But yet, here it says there was 300,000 men of Israel and 30,000 men of Judah. Now, some scholars say that this indicated that the writing of this passage occurred during the time of the divided kingdom. And I wanted to tell you, I think that could be a possibility. I'm not ruling that out. But I want to present a different opinion than that. I think the author is showing us the division that existed between the tribe of Judah, of which Simeon has now been absorbed a little bit, and the other 10 tribes. That there was, in fact, during this time, a sort of division between men. There was Judah and there was Israel. And you know, why list them separately? Again, why am I bringing this up? Just like Saul's characteristic of acting rash when times were overly stressful, the factions that developed in Israel will be seen in their behavior, in the behavior of the people multiple times. Even after David united the kingdom, there is going to be this underlying uneasiness between Judah and the rest. So I wanted to make sure that you understood that. And so I think the author is pointing that out in this chapter. that even then, then, there's a little bit of a division here. Ken, it's a question.
Where's Benjamin in all this?
Benjamin's with the northern tribes.
Israel, they're considered Israel, the 300,000?
Yes, so the tribe of Benjamin and Saul would be the 300,000 men of Israel. The two tribes of Judah and Simeon would be included in the men of Judah. It's hard with Simeon because we don't have one hero from Simeon, one leader from Simeon, one act of anything from Simeon. It's simply Simeon gets their allotment right in the center of Judah's tribal territory, and that's all we hear from Simeon. If we had a little bit more leadership and movement amongst the tribe of Simeon, maybe they would be mentioned, but when it says men of Judah, it's Judah and Simeon. The two tribes there are aligned, and generally Benjamin is aligned with the northern kingdom. And when they do divide, Benjamin will go with the 10 northern and be part of the northern kingdom. Except for Jerusalem. Jerusalem will stay and become part of Judah. Right. So I think that there's a divide here. We're going to see Saul acts a certain way, and we're also going to point out many times, look at the little division there between the peoples. We see divisions between those on the east and the west side of the Jordan. There was natural barriers. And then there was divisions between north and south, naturally occurring here. Now, God took care of the factions. I don't want to seem inconsistent. So I want you to understand that God took care of the factions in this chapter so that Israel would not be torn apart. That was the point, right? But we will see divisions that are deep-seated in the future. They're just deep-seated. The Lord keeps everybody together, and he really does, and he steps in. So there's no civil war, right? But we're going to see some that these divisions are deep in their hearts and come back as another characteristic of our studies. So the runners were sent back to Jabesh with great news that the majority of forces were gathered at Bezek. Thus, help was on its way. The leaders of the city decided to be strategically ambiguous. Notice what they said. They didn't lie to Nahash, but they stalled him, saying that they would come out on the following day, allowing Nahash to think whatever he wanted to think, which was probably that these Israelites realized that resistance was futile and that they were ready to surrender. No doubt that's what Nahash thought. And so they were trying to be a little ambiguous. We'll come out to you tomorrow. They're stalling now that they know help is on its way. Now, using a rather standard Israelite military strategy employed many other times in Scripture, it was also done by Gideon with his 300. Same way, Saul divides his forces into three groups or companies. Gideon divided his forces into three groups or companies. This is standard Israelite military strategy, and he attacks the Ammonites at morning watch. What does that mean? Morning watch was between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. Basically, before dawn, while it was still dark, he attacks. He crosses over the Jordan River and attacks Nahash's forces. Now, because the Ammonite troops were taken by surprise, probably expected to simply wake up and accept the surrender of Jabesh, they were caught off guard, and Saul's forces routed the forces of Nahash. And those who survived ran in all directions, and Nahash's army was effectively destroyed by midday the next day. Those who survived ran in all directions. This battle achieved not only the deliverance of the people of Jabesh-Gilead and what would have probably been a constant threat of war and oppression from the Ammonites. If the Ammonites were not put down at this point in time, they may have been dealing with the Ammonites for quite some time. And so this oppression is put down, the army destroyed. But on a spiritual level, God used it to give Saul a victory that would have awarded him instant notoriety amongst the 12. And more importantly, the confidence of the people. It was exactly what he needed to begin his reign and to keep the nation united. And you can see how the Lord worked in here. It was just what they needed. It's just what Saul needed. All right, this battle. Now men want to put people to death. And this is so typical in Israel and would be typical of human beings, what we see in these verses. Let's finish with the last 4 verses here. Then the people said to Samuel, "Who is he that said, shall Saul reign over us? Bring the men that we may put them to death." Do you know who he's referring to? Which men is he referring to? Yeah, the Ben Belial, the sons of worthlessness. But Saul said, "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished deliverance in Israel." Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there." So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. There they also offered sacrifices of peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. End of the chapter. Speculation is a necessary part of our studies and can be beneficial as long as I make it clear to you that what I find in a passage is an educated guess and nothing more. I don't mind speculating. I told you before that the nation of Israel had factions that threatened to push them into civil war. That was speculation on my part, but I think it's pretty consistent with the narrative. And of course, part of this was speculation, but notice that after such a resounding victory at Jabesh, what was the attitude of the military man who fought with Saul? Referring to the Ben Belial who did not bring Saul tribute, they suggested to Saul that the first order of business, now that we won this victory, let's bring the men that we may put them to death. They were referring to a group known as the Ben Belial. We talked about that. Now, the speculation part is I think they knew exactly who these detractors were, and they wanted them put to death. They knew who these guys were. It seems to me that the Ben Belial, these men, did not do a very good job of hiding their feelings about Saul. And it was pretty clear who this group, who these countrymen were. And they wanted them brought before charges and put to death immediately. Now, I also want to make this clear as we close today. It seems that I tend to criticize Saul for giving him no credit for anything he does, good or bad. I've been very critical of Saul, and I do understand that. But in this instance, I think this is Saul's finest hour. With a pure heart and by the power of the Spirit. Now, he's working in the Spirit, being led by the Spirit. This was definitely Spirit-led behavior. Saul tells the men that there is no more bloodshed on this day. He explains this battle was the Lord's victory. He's absolutely right. And it would dishonor him, the Lord, if they went after their brethren, especially because the victory today was given by God for the purpose of sparing Hebrew lives. We're not killing anyone. Saul's finest hour, led by the Spirit. So I'm going to give Saul credit right here, starting out so strong. The chapter ends with Samuel reinserting himself, but no longer as a judge in Israel. He will be God's prophet to Saul. He calls for another gathering at Gilgal, again, a special place where they've gathered many times before, in which they would recommit Saul as king. They're not making him king again. They're just recommitting that Saul is a king. They're reasserting Saul as king. They're giving their confidence to Saul as king. He was already made king, but they're recommitting to this covenant, and this would unify the nation. A great joyous celebration occurred at that gathering, and a feast was thrown in honor of the Lord and his anointed king Saul. How do we know that they had a feast? Does it say that they had a feast there? Zeva Shalamim. Zeva Shalamim. Peace offerings. Thanks, Pop. Peace offerings. Of course, they all ate together. They dined together, like kingdom eating. Peace offerings were so important. So he offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. A great celebration. Next week, we will study Samuel's address to the people of Israel as we have a new leader cemented in Israel. Chapter 11 cements Saul as Israel's new leader, and there are going to be no detractors, at least not publicly. God's will is accomplished, and the transition to a monarchy is complete. So I told you several weeks ago that these next chapters were going to be the transition. Now in chapter 12, we are in a monarchy in Israel. The final transition has occurred. But before this transition is complete, Samuel has to address the nation because he's now stepping down as what? Judge, Shofet. And now he's going to be full-time prophet to Saul. And so we're going to study his address next week. No, Samuel is both prophet, right, and he is a Shofet, a judge. But when he addresses the nation, he's going to say goodbye as judge, as leader, and make sure everybody understands Saul as leader. He's going to make clear that he has a clear conscience in everything he did. So we're going to see that address. And you can read ahead, chapter 12, as Samuel addresses the nation. And now it is Saul. Saul is king, and we now have a monarchy. Right? And we're out of the time of the judges here in this chapter. All right. I'm going to pray, and if anybody has any questions and they want to ask or talk further, we could do that. We have a couple minutes until actually 9:30. So be my guest to ask some questions, and we can talk a little bit after I'm done praying. So. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you for this study. Just thank you for your word, and just thank you for those who faithfully come out to study the life of Saul, the life of David coming up, and all these amazing events that occur as the nation of Israel goes from the time of the judges and steps up into the time of the kings. And so we see the transition. We see your hand of blessing. We see your work in manipulating human events, in working the divine plan. And that gives us confidence that you can certainly handle our lives and anything that's going on in America 2024. So I pray that we continue to apply these things to our lives, apply the Spirit's work in our lives, to see how you worked in the ancient Israelites and see how you continue to work today, Lord. Just encourage us with your word. Keep these truths in our hearts and our minds. Once again, I pray for not only the benefit from this study, but also from Pastor Paul, who's bringing the word to us today. Give him strength and wisdom, Lord, as he speaks to us through your word today in Sunday service. And pray all these things in Jesus' name.